Okay, I was born in Sheffield, Tasmania, Australia in 1936. And it was a little town of about 300 people. And it was the main seat for the county, so that any county things, which we called in Australia municipalities, uh, happened in Sheffield. My dad was the council clerk, which is like a county clerk. He was responsible for the roads and the police and the births, deaths, and marriages in the county. And so he got to be well known, and people came to him with their problems, financial problems and tax problems. And so he had a real impact among the people of our municipality or county. For example, I remember one day, I don't know how old I was, probably 6 or 7, a man came in with a potato bag, and in the potato bag he had a Tasmanian devil. And he showed this to my dad because Tasmanian devils were protected at that time. There weren't very many of them around, and so they didn't want it to go extinct. So they protected them, and you weren't allowed to trap them or do anything. But they brought this Tasmanian devil into Dad to show him, and I was there. We were standing out in front of our house, and the guy let the thing out, and the thing attacked my dad's leg. And Tasmanian devils have very sharp teeth, and my dad was squealing and shouting that this devil was after him, and the guy got him off and back in the bag. But that's a memory I have as a young kid. And that was because my dad had the responsibility for these kinds of things in the community. I was raised in a church in the town that had a real evangelistic heart. Um, the little church, it was made up primarily of farmers, a few business people, but largely farmers and their families. And in the community, we had little other churches that our main church in town was responsible for, and these were churches out in the country around the farms. And there were about 6 or 7 of them. And so every Sunday, two people from our church in town had to go out to each of these 7 locations and preach and run a Sunday school for kids. And so every man in the church was listed on what we called the plan. And the plan had every man, and for example, my number was number 10, and there were 44 of them on the list. And on the list would say number 10 and number 22 have to go to Paradise this Sunday and preach, and number 27 and 6 have to go to Beulah. These were all biblical names: Paradise and Beulah and Hell's Gates and all these other places that were around our community, because our community had been started by a lot of religious people. They weren't necessarily believers or Christians, but they were religious people, and they named all these towns biblical towns. Anyhow, I got to speak from the time I was about 10 or 11. I just don't remember the year I was put on the plan. But about 10 or 11, I got assigned to go to these towns, usually with an older man, and we would run a Sunday school for the kids, and then he would say, okay, you take the first 10 minutes, and I'd have to speak, and then he'd give the last 15 or 20-minute sermon. So that's how I got started, preaching and talking to people and sharing with people about the Lord. But it was a real training ground for just a young guy that was just starting out. Then I went to school in town for until I was 12, and at age 12, I went to high school in Devonport, which was about 20 miles away. So I got on the bus at 7:30 every morning and rode to Devonport, went to school, caught the bus back home about 3:30, quarter to 4 in the afternoon, get home at 5 o'clock. And then I would have responsibilities of cutting the kindling for the fire, because we didn't have central heat, we just had fireplaces. So you had to cut the wood, the sticks to start the fire, and then carry in the wood to put on the fire. And then I also had to run the separator, because we had a cow. And my dad milked the cow, and we would get the milk and then separate the milk and the cream, put the cream in a vented cupboard. We didn't have refrigeration, and then every 4 or 5 days we would put all the cream into the churn, and then I'd have to churn the butter and get the butter. And my mother, would make little patties of butter that we would use in the house. We had a large garden, probably a quarter of an acre maybe. It was a large garden, and we grew all the vegetables, all kinds of vegetables, probably 15 different kinds of vegetables. And my dad and mother ran this garden, and then I had to dig the potatoes and do the jobs like that. And there was a lot of pressure on me, because I had a sister, Helen, who was born after me, who was deaf, and as a result, my older brother and my sister Helen went off to a city, our main city in Tasmania, about 180 miles away, and they went to school there, and they were there for 3 months at a time. And then they would come home for a week, and then they would go back for another 3 months. So I was responsible for doing all the work around the house. There wasn't anyone else. So it put a lot of pressure on me, and I can remember my mother saying to me time after time, "Look, I'll help you," she'd say. "I'll help you." And that was music to my ears when she'd say that, and she'd come out to the woodshed and help me bring in the sticks and the different things like that. My mother was a compassionate woman who cared deeply for us as a family. Her focus was on the family. My dad had other gifts. His focus was really outward. He did a lot of outreach kinds of things. He ran a Sunday school for kids who were in rural areas that had no church, and so they would mail lessons to them every month, and then the kids would mail the lessons back, and they'd correct them and write notes to them, and encourage them on to learn about the Lord. And so that was called the Postal Mission Sunday School. And then my dad ran I guess it was every other month, a weekend for young men from around our state who had a heart for evangelism. And so we'd go to a different town in the state every 2 months, and we would go there for the weekend. We'd come in Friday night, and we'd show a movie, or we'd preach, or we'd run a program for kids, and then we would always end with an evangelistic meeting Saturday night, and invite all the town to come in. These were little towns with a couple of hundred people, and we'd get 30 or 40 people each time from the town, and preach the gospel and share the Lord with them. And so my dad did all these kinds of things. He was involved in setting up the camp, a large camp in our state that So his outreach, his heart was for outreach and evangelism and reaching people with the gospel, whereas my mom's focus was on the family and the home, and she was a good pianist. She played the piano, she played the organ, she played the violin, and it was all had a lot of musical ability, which I didn't get, I guess. But growing up in that environment was an environment of very structured, loving. Nobody ever said, "I love you," or anything like that, but it was obvious that we were loved and cared for and taken, given a lot of opportunities to grow and develop. I went off to high school, and in high school
Can I stop you there?
Huh?
Can I stop you there for
Yep.
1 second? I just have to, my camera